Hey New York City real estate lovers, in this video I'm going to be breaking down the top 3 things that you need to know about the new NAR guidelines and rules from all the lawsuits that I'm sure you've been hearing about, how that is or isn't going to be affecting Manhattan real estate, and most importantly, how that's going to affect you as a buyer or seller in Manhattan. I'm Dewey Moss, I'm your New York City real estate resource. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button, and let's get to it. So by now, I'm sure you've heard all about the NAR lawsuits that are going on, and the information out there has been confusing at best. I'm not going to go into great detail about the actual lawsuits themselves, but I am going to focus in on how the new guidelines affect you as a buyer or seller in Manhattan. Now, I should say before we get started that these are guidelines that are still being litigated in the courts. We have implemented some new processes, but are they final? No one knows yet, so things could still be changing. Now, there are 3 things that I think we need to concentrate on together to help you understand what the impact may be on you as a buyer or seller in New York City. Number 1, what the heck are the NAR guidelines and how are they being implemented? Number 2, who is going to pay the buyer broker's commission going forward? And number 3, what is this new buyer's agency agreement that you may be very well asked to sign? The first thing to take into account about the NAR rules and Manhattan real estate is that the majority of us agents in Manhattan are not members of NAR. We are members of the Real Estate Board of New York, or REBNY as we call it, and we have long since had some of the toughest rules and regulations in the nation when it comes to real estate buying and selling. So some of the NAR rules, while they may be slightly new and a slightly different way of saying things, we have already utilized here in Manhattan. So there may not be as much of an impact, but there are going to be some changes. So what are the lawsuits all about? It really comes down to the buyer's commission and who is paying that. New York City has long since been a co-broke market. That means that about 95% of all the deals in New York City happen with someone representing the buyer and someone representing the seller. That is because the New York City real estate market is complex and it is extremely complicated, and most buyers realize that it's to their advantage to have someone representing their fiduciary interests. Selling agents, we obviously know what they do and that they represent the seller, and their fiduciary responsibility is to the seller. But there is so much work on a buyer side that doesn't necessarily exist out in the suburbs. We're talking about co-op qualifications, condo qualifications, financial aspects, doing the co-op board application, which can be hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of pages long. Representing the buyer is something very different here in New York City, and we feel strongly that that should be compensated. Now, in the past, we've been able to advertise how much a buyer's broker would be compensated, and that compensation traditionally comes out of the selling compensation. All right, so for example, if a seller decides to offer a 6% commission, typically that commission is split 50-50 between the buyer side and the selling side. So 3% would go to the buyer and 3% would go to the seller. We are no longer allowed to advertise how much that commission is going to be. Apparently there were some bad practices out in the burbs where people were steering their clients toward the higher commissions or only to the ones that have commissions being paid. So therefore NAR has said no more advertising, and the courts have said that. So that is one change that's going to be taking place in Manhattan. Buyers brokers will no longer be able to see on the advertisement how much is being paid. They can, however, verify that amount with the selling agent and then let their clients know if a commission is being paid. To a large extent, the new rules about who is paying a buyer's broker commission is a bit of semantics. in Manhattan real estate. Because even though the traditional way of structuring this was that the seller would pay a commission to the selling agent, and that selling agent's agency would then offer a portion of their commission to the buying agent, we have to assume that in the majority of cases, that money is coming out of the proceeds of the sale. Correct? And where is the money coming from the proceeds of the sale? It's actually coming from the buyer. So in a way, the buyer and the seller have always split the commission, but it hasn't seemed like that. And in fact, many agents who haven't explained this well enough to their clients have always said, as a buyer's agent, oh, I'm free, you don't have to pay me anything because the seller is paying for my services. Not 100% true, and that was always a bit of a breakdown in communication. Now, however, the seller has the right to say, I'm only going to pay my broker and not offer any incentive to the buyer's broker. Now, what's different about that? What's different is the understanding that that was always the case. A seller and the commission that they're offering to a buyer's broker has always been negotiable. Now, traditionally, again, they've offered anywhere from 5 to 6%, and that has gotten split between the two brokers, but it has always been negotiable. So a seller could always decide not to offer anything other than compensation to the selling agent. Now, why would you as a seller want to offer that commission and offer that incentive? Well, it has a lot to do with our advertising practices in New York City, what we can and can't do because we have buildings that won't allow big signage and all that sorts of advertising. It also has to do with the sheer amount of traffic and the sheer amount of people represented by buyer's broker. You want as much traffic and as many eyes on your property as possible. And in order to do that, most people offer an incentive for buyer brokers to bring their very qualified buyers to your property. It makes a huge difference. So what does that mean for a buyer who is very used to having the buyer's broker commission come out of the seller side? Well, if there's an instance where the seller is not going to be offering any compensation to the buyer's broker, then a buyer would have to ultimately pay the commission. Now, was that always the case? Technically, yes. If a seller was not going to offer any buyer's compensation, then a commission did have to come from somewhere, and that would have to come from the buyer. It's just in the past, because our market is such a big co-broke market, that really hasn't been an issue. So will things change in the Manhattan market? I'm not so sure. Most of the experts think that for now, the sellers are going to continue to offer the same kinds of commissions, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less for co-broking, and that things will sort of go along as they normally have. But we certainly can't guarantee that. So if you're a buyer, best thing to do is to understand what your responsibility is, work very closely with their agent, understand if a seller is offering the buyer's compensation, and make a decision from there. If you as a buyer only want to see properties that are offering buyer's compensation, you have the right to decide that. Your agent does not. Your agent, from a fiduciary responsibility, has an obligation to show you anything and everything that fits your criteria. Best thing to do, communicate closely with an expert buyer's agent and work on it so that it benefits you the most. So the biggest change in the Manhattan market for the time being, because of these NAR guidelines, is the signing of a buyer's agency agreement. Now, in the past, a buyer could work with any buyer's broker without signing anything, and nothing became really legal until a contract was signed, and thereby the agent was due some sort of compensation. Now, however, because of the NAR guidelines and because we have to explain up front how all of the commissions work and what our fiduciary responsibilities are, buyers are being asked to sign an exclusive buyer's agreement. This agreement outlines how commissions work, what the expectation is going to be from the buyer in regards to commission, and the length of time you're going to work together, and a few other things. This agreement, and this is very important, this agreement must be signed before an agent can show you any property. Let me say that again. It must be signed before an agent can show you any property. Now, the length of term on these contracts make it a little fun in the way agents are approaching them. Some agents may do a 1-day agreement or a 7-day agreement just so that they can get you out the door and show you a few properties. From my point of view, you want to develop a good working relationship with a buyer's broker. That means you should take some time to interview the buyer's broker, to talk to them, at length, to understand what you're getting into, to make sure that they're going to abide by all the rules, and make sure that they're a good fit for you and their experience is such to where they can give you a good, solid, hopefully hassle-free and stress-free deal in a very complicated market. You may need to put in a little bit more time in interviewing buyer's brokers up front. This agreement also explains what the compensation is going to be for the buyer's agent, and if the seller isn't paying something, it outlines how much that compensation would be. So, for example, it may be up to 3% that is due. However, it also clearly states that we will make every attempt to try to offer for the seller side to pay that. So if, for example, the seller isn't paying anything, but you fell in love with this property and you want to go forward, it's our fiduciary responsibility to still work in your best interest. We shouldn't just say, well, they're not paying anything and that's too bad. We should put in an offer and ask for the compensation to be paid. So if we do that, the seller may look at what you're offering and say, you know what, that's a really good number. I'll go ahead and kick that amount in. That has been done quite a bit out in the outer boroughs. So farther out in Brooklyn, in Queens, up in the Bronx, some of that has already taken place. So it's all about the negotiation. But for you as a buyer signing the agreement, you need to make sure that whatever number is in the compensation agreement is of the norm. In other words, you don't want to see a compensation agreement where you could be responsible for 7 or 6% or the full commission like that. You want to make sure that it's aligned in that 3 or 2.5%, so that if you do have to pay the commission on something, on a property where the seller is paying nothing to the buyer's broker, that you're only responsible for the amount that you normally would be, that a buyer's broker would normally be getting. So are all of these new rules going to make a huge impact on the Manhattan market? Well, because the rules and guidelines are not 100% definitive yet and could be changing, and the information and the news that's coming out is very fluid right now, we don't know how much it's going to impact our market. But as of right now, we see the market in New York City as remaining strong. We see it as remaining a co-broke market, and we see it probably with most of the commissions still coming out of the selling side, because the incentive on the selling side is there to do so. Could it change? Yes. So keep looking for updates. Ask a lot of questions from your buyer's broker. And once again, I'm Dewey Moss. I'm your New York City real estate resource. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button. Take a look below on all sorts of different ways to get in touch with me. I would be happy to work with you as a buyer's broker and or answer any questions that you may have as we go through this complicated process together. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.